Hello everyone, this is just going to be a quick walkthrough of my method of tying on reeds, a slight elaboration on the time-lapse that I did a couple of weeks back. Firstly, the cane that I'm using, this is Alio, this is RC13 shape, so a little bit wider than I'd normally use, so I'll be tying onto a 46mm staple. So everything that I do will be 1mm shorter than you might expect from the staple upwards. So firstly, I'm going to fold the cane, making sure to be nice and precise. Just from feel, this piece of cane feels quite soft. It's good to feel a grasp of everything in the long run, so that you know what to expect later down. So from feeling that it's softer, when I get to the scrape, I'm not going to take as much out the back, probably. Otherwise the tuning might fly a little bit. So you might have noticed I'm tying on to a clamp. The reason for this is just because it keeps everything nice and in line. There's no tying at funny angles. And I'm going to use this thread. This is 100% polyester. I've got this other thread out just to give a quick example of something. The reason I use polyester is because it doesn't have any stretch in it, really. So there's no threat of pulling the thread too tightly, which in doing so can choke the cane. Just as a demonstration, this thread in my right hand, the blue thread, is nylon. So if I pull on both of these with the same force I would to tie on, you notice that I can pull the nylon thread quite a lot further than the polyester. So personally, I would recommend using the polyester thread. So before we tie on, I'm going to take a mandrel and heat the cane. The reason for this is just so that you can see, if I can find it somewhere. There we go. This piece of cane, as most are, is quite flat. This is very hard to find. Somewhere. When it's folded in half, particularly cane that comes off of a machine shaper, not a hand shaper, it doesn't match the same shape as the staple that we're going to put it on. So in order to change that, I'm going to heat it. So I'm going to take a piece of wire. For this step, I'd actually recommend not using wire. I would use a piece of straw. Unfortunately, I just don't have any currently. But for the purposes of this video, I will use a piece of wire. The reason I don't recommend the wire is for the same reason that I'd recommend the polyester thread, is that it's quite easy to pull the wire too tightly around the piece of cane, hence damaging some of the fibres in the sides of the cane, whereas straw just holds it nicely in place. I'd recommend making sure everything is really precise at this stage, because it will help further down the line. I think my top tip would just be literally just keep checking everything as you go. Don't just check it once and then continue on to the next step. Check it, move on, and then check again and again and again. Okay, so I've put this on just to hold it. Going to be tying onto a Cherugi staple, so I'll need my other mandrel. Just going to check it fits nicely. Yeah, so this is going to be wanted to be pushed on just until you feel a resistance so that it doesn't really want to go any further. So probably around there. I think my wire can actually go down a little bit from there. To around here. That way the resistance will come, yeah, around about here. Great. Okay, so the next step is heating the mandrel. I'd recommend using a lighter, or if you haven't got one and you're at home and you have a gas stove, you can use that, so just be careful, because you don't want to overheat the mandrel either. If you're using a lighter, make sure that you're doing it not in the yellow part of the flame, do it in the blue part, because the yellow part is not hot enough, and that will leave you with burnt carbon on the end of your mandrel, which then obviously you're putting the cane onto, and all of the tiny fibres in the cane will pick up that carbon, and the reed just won't be as clean, which we obviously want to avoid. So going to heat this just until it's, oh, don't die on me, lighter. Going to heat this just until it's not comfortable to touch, really. So it doesn't have to be for too long. Probably about here is enough. And then working quite quickly, because the mandrel tends to cool down relatively fast. We just push that on. Grab our thread. I don't like to start right at the bottom, just start a little bit further up, just lightly at first. If you pull too tight at first, you'll end up moving the cane and ending up with a funny shape. And then once you've got a few round, you can pull a little tighter. Just check at this point, as I said, check, check, check again. Everything's nice and lined up. Yep. So now I can start, as I'm also tying upwards, I roll down just to push it to the end. I think I've just about left myself enough thread. Check, check, check again. Is it still in line? Yes, good. Okay, I'm just going to go now. So what I'm looking for here now is at the top of the thread where both sides of the cane close evenly. Feels quite low down on this one, but I'd say it's about there. Just with not a massive amount of pressure, just to pull it closed. So if I let go of it, I can see it just starting to open. If you're pulling too hard again, it's just, you're choking the cane, you're making an unnatural force. So I'm just going to mark the end here with the pencil, that's roughly, yeah, where I'm going to tie on. So if I take this off now, just give it a wiggle, pull this down. You can see the shape now much better matches the staple. So this will fit much nicer, avoiding cracking, and it helps with sealing the reed as well. So the pencil mark that we've left, if we push the cane down so that the pencil mark lines up with the top of the staple, just give her a quick measure up to double check. going to go a tiny bit higher than my pencil line. Again, a lot of this stage is just by eye as well. The pencil line provides a good marker for where you should tie on the balance of where the cane should sit, but a lot of it I find is by eye. So obviously if I say I was putting it here, there's definitely not enough cane to wrap around, and if I put it too far, there's too much. So not enough, you'll end up with a smaller throat, which is good for tuning, but you will end up with a hole, and it's unusable at this point. There'll be a gap because there's not enough cane to come around. Whereas if I pushed it in, there's too much cane to go around, which means the blades are probably going to be tempted to cross. So I'm going to sit this one. I've done some trial and error on this shape, so I know roughly where I actually want this one to sit. It's not far off the pencil line, to be honest. Remembering that everything is 1mm shorter on this setup because of the 46mm staple. I'm tying on around 73. So on 47, I'd be tying 74, finishing 72, but I'll be finishing 71. Okay, so at this point I'm just going to look down the cane, possibly up at the light, just to check that the cane is in line with the sides of the staple, which it is, which is great. Check that everything's in line, which looks good. Looking down the staple I find is easiest for this. Let me grab the mandrel to make sure that as we apply pressure, the staple doesn't buckle under the weight. And we're just going to go what looks like around 2 or 3 rotations below the top of the staple. Just roll it one. I'm going to come back a little bit. Actually, I've not left myself enough space. Okay, so what we were checking earlier, whilst we were doing our first initial tie around just the mandrel, was that the cane was closing equally on either side. So we check again now that it is still doing that on the staple with equal amounts. Not that one side's closing and then with more force the other side closes. Check that as close as you can get, that it's closing equally, which it is, which is great. So I'm just going to go now. I've only got medium pressure on at the moment as well on the thread because I don't want to pull too tightly at the top of the binding, because again you might end up crushing or choking the reed a little bit. So this is medium pressure down to about here. I'm just going to wrap a couple more times so that I can hold this. Double check that my thread is at 46 so that it's lined up with the top of the staple exactly. I'm still holding the pressure here so that it doesn't unravel. Looks pretty good to me. Yep, so that's fine. Double check again, we're at the right angle. Could come just a tiny bit one way than the other. Just give it a little wiggle. Double check. Yep, looks good. Okay, I'll go back up with just a couple. And from about here, this is where I'm starting to put a fair force on the thread now, just to make sure everything's completely held in place. And then we just work our way down, keeping everything straight. If you notice around the binding that it's starting to become a bit wonky, on the first rotation, if you pull it so that it's just coming over this blade and just give it a pull back, you can sort of force the thread straight a little bit. But if you've got everything straight and tight from this point, it shouldn't happen too much. The benefits of it are obviously when you get to the bottom of the cane, it just makes it a bit easier crossing over from the cane to the staple. Just work our way down quickly but accurately. And then I like to, at this point, so I've gone now onto the staple. There's quite a gap on this piece of cane. I like to just go back over that piece a couple of times, like you would at the top of the reed where we cross over. Pull it tight and then cross over and come down just a couple more. That looks good to me. Just hold the tension with my hand and we'll double check. Yep, happy with the throat. It's not too wide, not too skinny, it's not pinched, which is good. There's no holes in any of the thread any of the way down, nice and tight. Yep, happy. So just going to hold the thread now, make a loop, pull it round. All the time I'm still holding the tension, so I'm holding it here, and then with my pinky I pull this tight here, put my finger over where the knot is going to be, again just to hold it tight, and just pull through. Make sure it just lines up nicely with the bottom, and then just a couple more times of the same. Some people like to do an opposite tie around the bottom. I used to, I don't anymore. I don't really notice the difference, to be honest. I think it's more important when you're first tying on to make sure that the way that you're rotating the thread around the staple goes with the not with the grain, with the rotation of the thread. So it's obviously made up of little threads. So if you're tying it one way, you're going to start unraveling it and it might become a little loose in places. So I'd say that's quite important. And now we just chop, snippy snippy, snip, snip. Now we can take a little bit more of a detailed look just to double check everything. So this wire is now loose. At this point, if you're using straws, you'd snip the straw. I can pull this wire off now. Just unravel. Just makes it a bit easier to check everything. Down the reed, down the staple, make sure that it's lined up with the cane still, which it is. Grand. Everything's in line. Fab. And then we just grab some clear nail varnish. And just around the bottom and the knot, just to secure. I tend to go just over where the cane has, where the thread has gone from the cane to the staple, just in case there are any holes. Sometimes just a little bit of nail varnish can sort that out. And then a tiny bit just on the ends of the strings above where we're going to snip it now, just to make good the knot. Take some scissors, chop it off, and leave it to dry. Grand. All sorted. 146mm staple, RC13 cane, tied on at 73. Very hard to see where this camera is. Fab. Thank you very much, everyone.